authority positions, religious figures, teachers, librarians, all kinds of people started to feel, parents, that comic books were destroying the youth of America.
Well, hello, everybody. So we'll just jump right into it, right? Yeah? Okay. All right, so I am Melissa Crum, diversity practitioner. So fancy way of saying holding these kind of difficult, sometimes seemingly taboo conversations with schools, nonprofits, companies around a variety of different things. But ultimately what we do is use art, creativity, storytelling, and critical thinking to bridge relationships with the diverse communities that they may serve. So today's objective is to really think about stories, and it really ties in well with talking about the trajectory of comics. So I want you to keep that in mind about how did this get started, right? Thinking about the comics, right? Who said it, what institution they were in, how did that jump from institution to institution, right? And how was that story validated, right? So just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind as we keep going. But today we want to think about, we all hold different stories about everything, but particularly about different groups of people. And those stories we create, we are given, and those stories live all around us. Right? We also have the opportunity to not only read those stories, but also kind of maybe edit those stories sometimes too. So the process we use when we work with different groups is it's called MCRP, or Multicultural Critical Reflective Practice. And what it is a way to investigate, analyze, critique those stories that we hold, but those stories that really guide how we interact with different groups of people. So we're really looking at the values we hold and thinking about, is that really helpful? Or maybe it is really great. Maybe some things we could utilize, maybe some things we can change, but we work to kind of investigate those types of things. So we'll do a little activity, what we often do in the beginning of our workshop. So what's this? Just yell out. McDonald's, Golden Arches, what else? Huh? Fast food trademarks. Anything else come to mind? Happy Meals. Unhealthy. So a lot of things come to mind when we see this, right? Now, depending on your relationship with this image, a host of things come to mind, right? It could be Happy Meals and family time. It could be eating hamburgers on a porch with a clown, which is kind of weird, but you know, it's cool. Low-wage work, globalization, childhood obesity. A lot of things could come to mind, but none of those things appear in this image, right? None of them do. It depends on the relationship or the stories we've been given or that we've created in relation to this image, okay? So what we do when we create these stories or create this meaning process is we see an image, right? Like our McDonald's sign here. We then say, okay, I see a yellow M, I see a logo, and then different ideas come to mind. What do we think about these ideas? And then we create a story. Right? So maybe that story is McDonald's brings families together, or McDonald's supports childhood obesity. Now, the people who are really great at this, jumping from image to story, are advertisers, right? So when you think of Nike, you don't think of cannolis, or maybe you do, but hopefully, if they're doing their job right, you don't. You think of sports or running or something, right? A series of stories come to mind. Well, the same way we do this with logos and image, we do the same thing with people. We do the same thing with individuals. We do the same thing with groups of people. So those stories that we hold about different groups of people can shape power, right? And those stories can have power. Now, it's important the power that those stories have given what institutions those stories lie in, okay? So when I say institutions, that means anything from military to education to police enforcement to anything, business, all of those things come to mind. But there are people within those institutions. Those people hold stories, and those people within those institutions have various amounts of power, right? So with those stories in those institutions, they create systems, right? And so all of those things come together, create what we're calling implicit bias, right? So really, implicit bias is saying, I have a story about a different group, a series of different groups of people, and that determines how I interact with them, right? But bias isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? So I have bias towards chocolate ice cream. Now, that might not be so great for my thighs, but it's great for if you give me vanilla and I don't really want it, right? So we have biases, and maybe I'm from Florida. I like warm weather, right? Or actually, I kind of hate humidity, right? Because I'm from Florida, so I have a bias. Actually, I have a bias towards Columbus weather, like this weather. It's kind of weird, right? So we all have different kinds of biases, but today we're going to talk a little bit about how those biases might go wrong, right? And how those biases can shape different kinds of prejudices. So when we do this work, we use all types of art, right? So whether we're using ancient samurai uniforms to really think about how we've created stories around Asian masculinity, or assumptions around virility, assumptions around samurai culture, or we're using Catherine Opie's photography around gender norms and family structures, or looking at Shirin Nishat's work around assumptions about Muslim women and assumptions about their oppression that we may or may not be very clear about. So we use all types of different art to bring those stories to the fore. And we bring those stories to the fore, we're able to say, okay, let me really read this story that I didn't even know I had, right? And some of these things work, some of these things are good things. Some of them, they're really guiding how I'm interacting with different folks, and that might not be exactly helpful, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about how these stories live around us in different kinds of ways. So one way is interpersonal, right? So I call you a name, you call me a name. We know those things are not necessarily great, right? We can kind of agree that name calling is not the best, right? And name calling based on someone's identity. We kind of know that it's kind of obvious. We say, well, I don't do those kinds of things. I'm a good person. I don't call people names, all those types of things. We know that. So that's one way of thinking about how those biases come to play, interpersonal. So then outside of that is institutional. So there are individuals in these institutions. So institutions, again, can be education, it can be finance industry, it could be home ownership or housing industry, medical care, criminal justice, all those different institutions. So there's people within these institutions who bring their stories into these institutions, depending if they have access to them and a level of power to shape whatever policies and procedures that are within those institutions. They're shaped by their stories. There are some individuals who don't have access to those institutions, right? And for a variety of different ways. So not only are they not able to get the full benefit of the access of those institutions, but they're not able to shape the stories within those institutions. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Then those institutions create systems, right? So when a story kind of catches fire, right? So when we think about the comic book industry, we had this one kind of psychologist who had this idea. Well, then now we have a government committee about it, and then so the institutions this one story starts catching fire, right? And starts shaping different procedures and policies, and the people within those institutions have the power to keep those stories alive. So the thing about that is that when those stories sit in those institutions, they live beyond the person who created them, right? So what encapsulates all these things are theories, like the theory that comic books ruin the lives of children, or that women's work is less valuable, right? So that's a really old story that women's labor is less valuable. But interestingly, it still shows up in institutions today when we know women get paid less for the same work, right? We know that wage gap. So that's an old story from a few different people who had power that came and lived in different institutions, which creates a system, right? Now, any identity marker can be placed within the system, right? But we have to look at who had access to, from the interpersonal to these institutions in order to create a system. Whether if we keep with women, we know that workplace is not necessarily situated in a way to support pregnant women, right? Whether it's low wage or corporate. Corporate is a little bit better, right? You get maternity leave. But if you work at McDonald's, you don't necessarily get maternity leave, right? We know all women have babies, regardless of where you work. So think about that, man. So who created this system to allow that to be effective or not helpful? So keeping in mind who was able to shape the stories to create the policies, right? And so it's important that this is cyclical. So it's not linear. So the folks who are creating these stories make it these institutions to help systems, but these theories are created by people, right? So it goes in this big circle, right? So that's why sometimes when we want to focus on the interpersonal, if somebody says, no, this is a systemic problem, we can't point to one person like we could that person who called us a name. We have to say, wait, there's a pattern here. We have to see how this lives around us. And so it becomes a bit more difficult when people say there's institutional issue here, there's a systemic issue here. And so it's a little bit more complex, and that means it's a little more difficult to resolve, right? Because we want to point at one thing or one person or one policy, and it's not always that simple. So the big thing is that with theories and these systems and institutions and interpersonal interactions, they live beyond the interpersonal. They live beyond those individuals. It becomes a series of individuals who get impacted by these things. So we'll go through a little snippet of what we might do in a workshop. So this is a Carrie James Marshall piece. And so what we would normally do is say, tell me about who's in this image. What comes to mind? What ideas, what things do you think about when you see this image? And oftentimes when we talk about these, when we use this image, we're not only talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about there's institutions that are present in this image that we want to question and think about how those institutions might be interacting with individuals in this image, and what comes up for us as individuals when we see these things. And it could be a series of things. And although this is one image, just like the McDonald's, all of us are going to have different stories, right, that come up for us. And that's going to be important. So when we are thinking about stories, we have to think about the stories that are given to us. Now, depending on the society you're in, the normal is going to change, right? So in the United States, we have 8 elements of what is considered normal. So that's white, male, middle class, heterosexual, English-speaking, able-bodied citizen, right? So if I said I had this white guy friend who lived in Worthington and he goes to church, you'd be like, okay, that's kind of normal. Mm-hmm. But if I said I had a paraplegic lesbian Buddhist friend, it sounds like, whoa, that's weird, that's really different. Is it really weird and different, or is it just not this, right? So it's important that we think about the way stories are structured in the US in particular, that the less of these elements you have, the more different you are seen, right? The more different you are. Now we can add ageism in here, we can add some other things as well. But the crux, particularly in the US, now again, if you go somewhere else, this list is gonna be different. So we have to think about, all right, so this is a story that overtly or covertly has been given to us that shapes policies, procedures, and various institutions. So it's important when we think about, again, stories that are around us. So let's go to early stories, right? Again, we're thinking about the Carrie James Marshall piece, we're thinking about the boys. So we have a theory, and again, theory encapsulates all of these things. So back in 17th century, there's this thing that happened, Enlightenment theory. Now, a lot of things happened. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of great things that happened during the Enlightenment period. One thing that came out of there is this idea of race. Race did not exist before that. Everybody was very specific about how they identified, whether I'm specifically French, or I'm specifically Igbo, or I'm breaking stuff, or I'm specifically whatever that might be. I'm specifically Romanian, whatever that is. But after this period, we start getting classifications. So we had different academics creating theories around categorizing individuals, at the same way they would categorize animals. And when they categorized these individuals, they asserted certain values, right? And they also created different kinds of theories. So whether it was environmentalism, which is not how we understand environmentalism today. So at that point, it was be careful about who you interact with, who you're next to, because those values you might start to internalize, right? So it's good to separate people, because this kind of made up, uncited idea that if you're separate, then you're likely to be more prosperous. Or phrenologists who assume different intelligence based on cranium size, right? What sounds kind of crazy today, but that was a real theory. We call that pseudoscience now because it has no grounding. But then it was a very real thing from a handful of individuals within institutions. Now, fast forward to 1932. We know a series of things happened between 16th century and then, right? We can kind of fill in the gaps. Serious things that happened. But to fast forward, we have this concept called redlining, right? And what it was is and this happened all over the country, but we're just looking at Columbus right now. So you had the real estate industry say, okay, well, we're going to separate different groups of people, and we're going to say that in certain areas is the good areas, and certain areas are not so good areas. And if you're in a green or a blue space, the bank will finance your loan, right? So now you have another industry kind of catching on to this story, where we're not saying we're not going to finance your house because you're black or because you're another identity. We're just going to say we're basing it on this map. So conveniently, you have red and green areas like Upper Arlington, where you had in deeds that said you can't sell this to what was considered an ethnic white, like Italians, Germans. That's why we conveniently have a German village, Italian village, because they weren't allowed to live in other spaces. But even so, those were still very separated from, let's say, like the King Lincoln district, which was a red area. So that means even if you had the money, you could not get a bank finance loan, right? Same thing in places like Bexley. So then we kind of go back to this theory of neighborhood life cycle, which again comes from academia, again this idea that neighborhoods cycle, right? So what happens, it's interesting, they only cycle in red line areas. So there will be a purposeful disinvestment from those areas. So if you keep the property value low, that means your taxes will be low, which means there's less funding for schools, less funding for a series of other things, right? There's a way in which it was purposely disinvested. Well, then they cycle back around and then pour a lot of money in the space. Now in that cycle, we kind of call that part of the cycle of gentrification or a series of other things. But then they cycle right back out, right? Into other spaces, and we saw that happen. We're seeing that happen in like Linden, for example. And we saw that happen in downtown, because downtown was, I think this is downtown, was a yellow area, right? I don't know if you've been here a while. Now I've only been here about 11 years. But apparently, downtown didn't look like it did right now, right? So it was a yellow area. If you wanted to buy a house over there, I believe that's Italian Village, right? So usually the ethnic white areas were the yellow areas. So that was considered, if you're ethnic white or poor white, you could live there. But in the red areas was oftentimes if you were black and you could not get a loan. You had there was not an investment there. Again, thinking about an idea, this theory, and how it can permeate into institutions and create policies and laws. So now you're starting to see how these, the long-term effect of this redlining. So for example, in redline areas, you can also, there was policy that allowed factories to be there. So if you ever go to Linden, you go down Joyce, you'll see a series of factories there. The problem is we're now seeing environmental indicators that are showing health disparities that are happening in those redline areas where there was a purposeful disinvestment as well as factories there. So this from the Curran Institute, and you can see in these areas you have a high rate of cancer, particularly this is Linden, this is South Side, and this is Hilltop-ish area. You have high infant mortality. You have a high indicator of a series of things, right? So when we have programs like Safe Sleep, which is really important, right? It's a great way to think about these things, but we got to say, wait, it's bigger than that. It's something else, right? There's a series of things that's been happening that we have to overturn, and we can't just say, you know, we just put more money into a school or to have safe sleep. So we start seeing this environmental impact from this redlining that happened 70 years ago, right? From a story that happened 400 years ago. But we're seeing, again, the story lives beyond the individuals who are there, who are present. So then we start thinking about going back to that kind of phrenology idea around intelligence and value and that hierarchy. So we look at the work of Jennifer Eberhardt, who is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner. She's at Stanford. And she did work around how are people getting sentenced, for example, in the criminal justice system. And what she found in particular is that Black individuals who do the same crime as white individuals are getting more time, right? But even more so, within Black individuals who have done these crimes, if you have what's considered more ethnic features, so you have darker skin, wider nose, wider lips, you have an even longer sentence, right? Now, is the judge saying, wait a minute, this person has a wider nose, we're gonna give her 3 extra years? No. So that goes back to a story, implicit bias, around who should be punished more than someone else. And what values do we put on individuals based on how they look? Again, thinking about our McDonald's, right? We have a story when we see something, when we see individuals. And so we're seeing this trend nationally, right? We see that then permeate into another institution, to schools, where we're seeing black boys in particular, are getting harsher punishment, specifically more suspensions, when they do the same infractions as non-white peers, right? Now, our teachers consciously saying, I'm gonna suspend this boy and not suspend this girl because of their race, or maybe not, maybe so, probably not, right? What happens is we have a story that we hold that guides our actions, and if we're not careful about considering that story and really thinking about how much it's being used, then we'll use it all the time, right? And so we're seeing a national trend that's happening this way. So again, when we bring these images, when we do these workshops, and we start off, tell me what you see. Tell me what comes up for you. Tell me what do you think, right? We're able to begin to write those stories that might have been hidden in the back here, and bring them to the fore. And start to say, I didn't realize I was thinking these things about these boys, or about where they are, about where I think they may live, or I think what their family structure is, or whatever assumptions we might be having. We can say, okay, now what can I do about that? Because we have the power to rewrite stories. And then when we're in institutions, we have the ability to bring our stories into those institutions. We have the ability to rewrite how those institutions interact with different groups of people. So it's important to always think about how power shapes stories, right? Stories shape institutions. So we have to think about whose story is being allowed in an institution. Do they have the power to rewrite whether stories is being used here. Institutions shape systems, and systems recreate power. It's a cycle. So we can find ourselves, where do we insert ourselves in these institutions, in these systems, and how do we utilize our individual respective power to alter stories that might be there that might need to be changed. You might find there's some stories that are good as they are, but there's always something that could be altered to make sure it is more inclusive or considering of different stories. Thank you.